first of all, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining. We'll have 2 minutes past, so I'm going to start. So hopefully you've seen the agenda, you've joined the call, but yeah, today is about creating a successful business case for migrating to the cloud. The truth is we're going to touch on various areas actually, migrations, business case, investments, but that often kind of moves off into other areas and different discussions. And part of that, we're really happy today to have Stephen with us from Save the Children, who will be discussing some of this with me today as well, and will be available at the end for Q&A to really add a little bit of experience, real project experience, and some examples for some of the stuff I'm going to cover. So yeah, Stephen will introduce himself later on in the session, but yeah, huge thanks to Stephen for joining us today. We're going to cover a little bit around assessments, business cases. If anyone's ever been on a webinar with me before, Cloud Adoption Framework, of course, will pop up. But the main point of today is I'm going to start with some slides, but I'm going to move through those fairly quickly. What I want to do is spend the majority of the time showing you a tooling or piece of tooling that we have access to that can assist in creating business cases. Doesn't give you the full business case, but it gives you the majority of it. So that's what I want to get to fairly quickly. And then I'll have a discussion with Stephen from Save the Children and open up to a Q&A. So I promise this will not be death by PowerPoint. Wasn't expecting this transition. Just quickly around Transparency. I've been at Transparency now for over 6 years, and we have grown to become a partner in the UK that now covers all of the Microsoft verticals, as you can see on the screen there, from modern work to business applications, all the way to security, and the practice that I'm a director of, which is the Azure practice. So full end-to-end solutions that we provide. And as you can see on the screen there, we are very highly and well accredited, whether that's from solution partner designations, from expert MSP, and also, of course, very proud to be the 2025 Partner of the Year for non-profits as well. So if you've not come across us before, there is one slide, but I would advise you, if you haven't come across us before, to visit our website. So, creating a successful business case for migrating to the cloud. I want to start off with a few slides before we go into the demo. And then the first one I want to talk about, before we talk about business cases and value, let's talk about why you would want a business case and why that can provide value. And the obvious place here would be migration objections. I've had a discussion already this week with a customer on Tuesday, and there are discussions I have almost weekly with businesses that are interested in migrating to the cloud, whether they currently have workloads on premises, possibly in another cloud provider. But we often have those conversations, and the first thing we would want to do with any customer is start to assess, start to put a business case together. And that's important because, as you can see on the screen, there are a lot of objections to migrating. One of the obvious ones being cost predictability. We have no idea what those costs could be. Moving from a CapEx to an OpEx model can be difficult for some businesses. They don't trust in that. Performance uncertainty is another thing that actually comes up quite a lot. If you're a business who are running your workloads now and they work, they're performant, and you're not having problems, that can sometimes be a risk to a business to pick that up and move it somewhere else. We'll touch on why you should move to the cloud in the next slide. But risk of downtime is another one, and of course this is important. Not just with migrations, actually, this can happen with changes, but migrations can occur downtime. It depends what you're migrating. It depends on the use cases for that tool, the users, where it's geographically located, but it can happen. Of course, it's a risk, and it can sometimes be a reason why people are worried about going down that migration route. Security concerns is an interesting one, because I'll flip this in a second and say that actually security concerns should be a reason why you move into Azure. But actually, if you're a business that are very comfortable with their current security boundary, they can physically see their servers, feel like they can see their data. Actually, there is a concern there for businesses, because security boundaries change dramatically, permission levels change dramatically. The way you deal with users changes dramatically. So for some businesses, it's actually a concern and objection. The second most common on the screen that I hear on a weekly basis after cost predictability is technical knowledge. You may be used to managing infrastructure, applications or environments in the same way for the last 10, 20, maybe 30 years. And actually moving to Azure can be quite scary because of that knowledge gap. That is very, very common. It's very rare actually we go into a migration where a customer says our team are fully experienced in Azure. They're going to be wanting to do most of this themselves. That's really rare. What's important is knowing where you want to be, what the operating model is, and try and actually resolve that as you go through the migration, which I'll touch on. Outside of cost predictability, there's another cost to every migration, and that is the cost to doing it. Whether that's Transparity as your partner or another preferred partner, that there will be a cost to that migration. It will take a specific amount of time. There will possibly, likely be a cost to that. That's also an objection. And finally, super high level one here, but some people it's just change. The objection is change. And that can be for various reasons that we see that. And I won't get into those because they become quite personal for some people working in some of these businesses. But you do see one of the objections could be sometimes a personal fear of change within a business, or a personal fear of a lack of knowledge within a business. So I think picture these all as a wall that blocks a business from migrating. And the business case is very hard to get signed off, and is often due to the lack of confidence in these objections. So if we can provide the trust, then that wall and these objections here start to fall down. And that's what, in the hope of what a business case can achieve. Let me flip that on its head. Okay, you've got objections to not moving to the cloud. Well, what's the cost of not migrating? Scaling in Azure and other cloud providers is a big plus. The ability to scale up and down and only pay for the resources you require. Retail businesses, this is huge around Christmas time, for example. For non-profits, we've worked where we know there's been a certain push or a certain event where they know that donations have always picked up after that event. So knowing that you're able to scale and make sure that you can take those donations is, of course, super, super important. So scaling is massive. I flip that security problem around here. Some people see it as an objection. I would say Microsoft's investment is mostly aimed at cloud-based solutions. Same with some of the security-based services that we have available to us today. Competitive advantage. We speak to businesses that want to be able to scale faster, go into new markets faster, utilize brand new services and cutting edge services. For example, the amount of work we're now doing with artificial intelligence has, of course, increased. And that's going to be very difficult to tap into some of that advantage when you're still on premises and not in Azure. The obvious one, infra overheads, whether that's physical server expenditure, whether that's licensing, I think VMware and Broadcom, but there are infra overheads, there are disks to support, server racks to maintain, for example, which isn't the need in Azure, especially if you go down the adoption route and adopt things like PaaS services. That infrastructure overhead has also some management overheads. In traditional IT, there's a lot of backups, patching, the type of stuff that really you should be automating, free up time in your team so they can focus on areas where they can deliver value. And finally, a really common use case for businesses that haven't fully migrated into Azure or haven't migrated at all yet and are thinking of doing so in the future is the ability to replicate and use Azure as a secondary site or as a site for your backups. Usually traditionally much cheaper than a traditional DR scenario, is you don't need them both sat there live at the same time, which I won't go into, it gets rather technical, but I flipped it on its head there. And the point here is to go from migrating is a cost, or there's a cost that comes with migrating, and flip that to no, not migrating, that's the true cost to the business. That could be the problem to a business later on the line, is actually not migrating. I talk here very general, right? My honest opinion is there are businesses we have worked with, there are businesses that exist that operate in a manner now where actually there may not be value moving to Azure, but it's very rare we see those candidates. Why does a business case matter? With those two previous slides in mind, and before we move into a demo, a business case matters because you've got to touch on all these areas. You've got stakeholder alignment. If migrations touch every part of a business, including finance, operations, security, and a business case gives everyone a single source of truth to rally around and discuss. It brings everyone a part of the project, and it's important to do. Really, in any large-scale IT projects, actually, not just migrations. It's important that it translates technical benefits into language that a board or a CFO, for example, can actually understand. Can they understand the risk? Do they understand the return on the investment? That's important in a business case. Taking that, I mentioned earlier on, Fran, you have certain people that sometimes have personal blockers to migrations, and that's emotional. So most of the objections on the slides before, are based on fear and assumption, not actual data. And the point of a business case to replace that, go from we think it will be expensive to it's going to cost exactly this much a month. So taking that emotion and turning it into real data is obviously super useful when it comes to a business case, and that's why it matters. A good business case isn't going to say, let's move to the cloud. Some people have actually said that to us before, we want to move to the cloud, but a good business case would actually be well defined, well scoped, clear around its approach, for example. All of that together makes you think about what could go wrong, not start now and spot the risks halfway through, spot them early on. And finally, there are certain parts of a business case, specifically things around predicted cost and predicted services, the technical side of a business case, that can be used by partners such as ourselves to unlock Microsoft funding, but you could also argue that most of the time business cases are actually used to unlock internal funding. A lot of people we speak to are taking these business cases then to their board to unlock funding for the next, financial year and so on. So when people think about assessments, when people think about business cases, a lot of it is around tooling and the technical side. And I am going to show you that today, but it is important that it touches on all these other areas. Here it is, the cloud adoption framework slide. I've presented this slide a lot. I'm going to move over it fairly quickly today. If a business case is the answer, how do you do it? You don't start from scratch, and thankfully Microsoft have created the cloud adoption framework, which gives us a proven structure. It's actually a structure for the whole migration journey, all the way to completion and then management and optimization of that. But within what we're talking about today, within this framework, the assessment phase and the business case is covered by those first two stages, the strategy and the planning stage. You can see there it touches on things like making sure the skills are ready, making sure the business is aligned. So this is not just, I want to move a SQL server to here, this is how we do it. This is thinking about other things within the business. And that's what we're going to dig into now, is what would a valuable assessment actually look like and the tooling that can support it. So one more before we talk about the tooling. A genuine assessment that's useful will involve people, process, and tech. So from a people standpoint, it will talk about the operating model, today's operating model and the future operating model. It should talk about stakeholder mapping, who owns what part of the migration, the planning, the assessments, and so on. Where have we identified skilling gaps? How do we plug those skilling gaps? It could be exam vouchers, it could be training from a partner, for example. In terms of process, do you have the governance structures for this? Do you have compliance requirements, ISO, PCI, SOC, whatever that may be? Do you have specific procurement cycles we need to be aware of? Is your data center contract ending in March? Is it ending in September? Do you have other vendor contracts that are ending as well? What's your change process? Is there a change process that we would have to go through to migrate and do this work? That's important to know early on because it can add time. And in terms of technology, the pillar I'm going to focus on with the tooling, what is it you're looking to move? What are those applications speaking to? What will they look like in the new world? And a lot of people, when thinking about an assessment, will likely think about that final column only. For a successful migration that drives value for a business, it needs to have people, process, and technology involved. Hence why you should be touching on as much of these as you possibly can. Some of them may not be possible for various reasons, but if you can cover as many of these on the screen as possible, you should add more and more value to that business case. So, part of that business case, however, the first bit that we usually do with a customer is to understand the technology. It gives us an understanding of a breadth of a project, the scale of a project, and then we can start leaning on the cloud adoption framework to talk about operating models and skilling, for example. We now have access to a cool tool called Dr. Migrate. We still have access to a previous tool we're using, which is the native Azure Migrate provided by Microsoft as part of Azure Portal. The reason we've started to use Dr. Migrate is because it has a lightweight collection with no need for infrastructure or agents. It runs one time from a jump box. It adds Nutanix discovery to its capabilities, with Azure Migrate does not natively. And it provides over 100 interactive dashboards. It's AI assisted. But most importantly, I'll show you in a second, it ticks a lot of those technology boxes in that column. But also, a lot of other assessment tools are very much a one-shot, tell me what I've got now, tell me what it's going to cost. What I will show you in a second is that Dr. Migrate can actually be used all the way through the migration projects. Even after you've assessed and created a business case and decided to go ahead, you can still use this tooling. And before I show you the demo, because there's a bit that happens just before the demo, an admin runs the DMC, which is a collector on an environment once, and it will pull the information. It stores that information in a zip folder with the password provided to the customer. No information taken from this collection is sent externally, other than what we have on this zip file, and it is always password protected. It also does not retrieve personal information. It will understand what apps you have, but it won't understand the data within them. Once someone in our team or within the business has run that DMC and pulled that scan, what we will then do is be in a situation where we have Dr. Migrate loaded. I'll stop just now before the demo, just to see if there's any questions on that last section. Nothing. Chat. Yeah, no questions in the chat, so I'll carry on if that's okay. So as you can see here, the tool has discovered over 1,000 servers. It's mapped some applications and it's talking about storage. Now, I'm not going to show you every screen in here, so we could do multiple webinars on this, but what I want to show you is some really valuable areas. So first of all, it's a standard dashboard. We can see what this has done. We can check on the data health. When was that data pulled? One thing to be aware of, a bit of a tip on this tool. Yes, it uses what's called the DMC, the Dr. Migrate collector, to pull information. Actually, if you've previously used Azure Migrate, whether that's yourself internally to assess or you've used with another partner, you can also plug Azure Migrate into this system so it can give you information live. So if you change something next week, the document will see it's happened. Whereas if you just use a DMC collector, it's a one-time grab of information. But outside of checking data health, one of the first things we do when we do these assessments with our customers, we will have a workshop, and we do that to understand things like deadlines, current licensing, because this is important to the tool. So one thing you can do, for example, is you may have special rates negotiated with Microsoft. We can pull that information into this tool to make sure that the prices we're giving you at the end is actually true to the prices you will be paying, not something we've just taken from the Azure calculator. So it can take those customized pricing models from you if you've got them. Then we can start to set certain things. Do we care about backups for non-production servers? Do we want monitoring of non-production servers? And this is just bits of information to allow it, when it gives its output, to be more valuable specifically to you. One of the most important parts of this setup is this here. Do you already have licenses? Are you going to benefit from hybrid use licenses across Windows or SQL cores? You can save a lot of consumption costs if you already own licenses. If you have them, we can tell the system to have you, and it can blend that into the rates and the consumption costs at the end. Where we really want to start with is here though. So as you would expect, it has found all the servers. Okay, it's gone in there, and if we want, we can edit these servers. We may want to edit their name, whether they're production, non-production. We can add notes. I'm not going to touch on anything else just yet, but the point is, it will discover all of your servers. We can tell it that some are in scope and some are out of scope. It's usually easier for us to assess everything and then a customer tell us what's in scope instead of just trying to point a tool at specific things, but we can do that. But where this tool really comes to in its own, and where it goes above and beyond Azure Migrate, is even this early on in the usage of the tool, is, for example, this CMDB assistant. So this has mapped all the applications found on these servers. It finds the tools, it puts them into different kind of groupings, and then what that enables you to do is, for example, say you may pick one of these tools, Cognos, and it's showing me the VMs. So this works from a level of an application and a workload. And a lot of times when people are thinking about migration, you think too much of, I've got 5 VMs to move or 1,000 VMs to move. It should be, how many applications are you moving really? We can edit this. We can view things like network connections, have a look where is it speaking to something else that we need to pull into that group. But as you can see, it is very good at pulling applications from those VMs. Now here, it's identified applications. It's not quite sure what it is. It could be a custom line of business app, for example, but we have the ability to view one of these, have a look at what it could be, give it its right name, map it to a server. You can see here there's quite a lot of servers involved in this application. So the point is that automatically using AI assistant up here, that's how this has been done. You can map applications, and then we may work with a customer to start to make edits there to make sure all of that information is correct. But the first part of the tooling is, after we set it up, is the inventories part. And as you can see at the top here, it goes through a flow from left to right. And the best way to use this tool is actually to go through that flow from left to right. So we've discovered and we've started to map applications. That's important at this stage. If we wanted to view the application in more detail, we can do so again here. For example, we can edit those as well. So this is very much from an application point of view. Now, this is where Dr. Migrate again provides a lot of value above traditional assessment tools, especially Azure Migrate. When we kick these off, I mentioned earlier, we will have a workshop with a customer. Now, in that workshop, we're going to ask questions around, what's your target migration? When are you exiting the data center? How are you looking to manage this and staff this? Would you be managing these workloads internally once it's completed, or a partner? This is important information that we were touching on earlier on. That's not exactly technical, but it's all a part of the business case. And we take all this information to make sure that what we build out of this is actually an assessment that's true value and not just a next finish exercise. So once we've decided on those goals, we've decided on that we prefer, say, VMs, or we may prefer AVS. Maybe we've got a high interest in using PaaS services for things like databases, but less so for web apps. And there may be various reasons. You may not know, it may be undecided, but the more info we can give the tool, the more it'll start to narrow down as we go through. So we can give high level goals. I mean, commonly a goal is, most businesses would like to modernize or understand lift and shift carries less risk. So let's move into the cloud and modernize where the risk is at the least. And then in the future, maybe start to take on some more critical applications. And that's a common way of doing it. And this system would allow you to do that. You then choose a pathway. So this is selected for me based on what I've selected on the last page. But is there migrate as is, or traditionally known as a lift and shift? Is it modernization focused, where we're trying to modernize everything, or is it that option that is most commonly used by most businesses, which is light modernization? Let's get everything moved, but if we see good options for modernization with very little risk, why not do it, right? Why not? So we selected light modernization in this case. And then it gets a little more technical, because then at this point, we can use AI to map them. But at this point, then we can actually see what it's starting to target technology. So an Access database could become Power Apps. MySQL could become Azure database for MySQL. And again, the Microsoft native tooling does not have the ability to do this over such a vast amount of applications. And we may say, actually, no, that Access database, that's getting retired. We've moved on to something else. SQL, there may be a reason why we don't want to move to the Azure version. I don't know, but there's various reasons, but you can put them all in this tool. And you don't have to do it all now. Some of them you may be unsure of, and that's fine. But by giving it all that information around the goals, telling it your inventory of what you've got, telling it your goals, and allows you to start to correctly plan for this. So here we start to see assigning strategies against different applications. Then move into what we call a state rationalization, 6R treatment, 5Rs. Some people say there's 8Rs now. In this case, most of them have been rehosts. I think I clicked one that could be a SaaS. So you can imagine here, if someone's more modernization focused, you'd see a lot more in things like re-architect and re-platform, but here most of it's rehost. And again, we can change this. There's applications, possibly move one of them to a different section. One thing to also be aware of on this whole system, you may have noticed it, when we're doing this for 500 or 1,000 servers, that can be a lot of work in a GUI. There is the ability throughout this system on almost every page to essentially export everything as a CSV and then push that CSV back into the system with changes. So if, for example, you wanted to give one of these spreadsheets to an application team and let them decide or make some decisions, they can do, and then you can pump this CSV back into it, which is sometimes useful, especially on bulk actions. App sizing, this is important because it plays a part in wave planning. So what this does is it allows you to create rules here, and those rules will dictate whether an app is low, medium, high, very high, or extra high. And the reason that's important is because then we can put an effort number against them, and that helps when it comes to migration planning, wave planning, and that type of stuff. So you can assign the parameters, you can change the parameters, and then it will assign them to different applications, which we've already assigned servers to those applications. So as you can see, we've really flowed through. And every time we go onto a new window, it's almost like we're adding more data, more information into the system, which then will follow with the final stage inside of Dr. Migrate. If at the start I gave it I told it when I want to start a project, and then I told it a deadline, then I've told it what's in scope. I told it how difficult those things in scope may be to move, and now it's taken all that information and it will create wave planning for you. So it's decided that squad one, the pilot wave, for example, is going to be moving some low-hanging fruit, FileZilla, Key Store Explorer, things that are easier to move. So it's actually broke the application down into those waves and started to create those groups, usually building up into complexity, making sure that it's grouping up applications dependencies on each other. Again, this was a fairly manual step previously. This is now built into the system end to end. And then you get to migrate, which isn't actually something you can do with Dr. Migrate, although they do have a lot of things coming soon. What we would normally do at this point, and just to end my kind of bit around the demo, is once all this information is being added into this system, the first point I want to make is we can always go back. And what commonly happens is workshops with customers where we'll bring this dashboard up and we'll start to edit some and make some amendment. So we can always go back. And We can have a license for Dr. Migrate for 90 days for free. But if it's a paid for license, you could go back to this over the space of a couple of years. The data won't be lost unless the license disappears. But then once all this has been completed, then you're able to go to this section, which is insights. Well, we were just mentioning before the call, I brought this up, but in true art attack fashion, instead of clicking these and waiting for them to generate, I'm going to show you some in a second. But just to give you an idea, you can have exec type reports, which is really aimed at board and CXO kind of level, PowerPoint, big on numbers, big on risks, big on planning and things like that. And then there's the more kind of detailed ones around strategy planning. And just so you're aware, I mean, the number of reports that can be pulled from this system, along with Power BI dashboards as well, is quite significant. And I'll show you. Is anyone on this call that's ever kind of spoken to Microsoft before? Microsoft used this tool for assessments, Dr. Migrate. And this is what their output looks like. So if anyone's seen a deck that looks like this before, now you know where that deck's come from. But here's an example that we maybe present to a customer. Now think back to that first slide. Blockers for customers, things that they need to know to give them that confidence, especially in that technical pillar that I showed you. Being presented a deck that's clearly understood your technical environment. It's clearly, let me make that a bit bigger, understood your applications. Cost was the number one reason, unpredictability of cost. Let's predict that cost across 3 different scenarios. Maybe you want to rehost it all. Maybe you want modernization. Maybe it's Azure VMware only, or let's predict the cost. Let's not only put one scenario in front of a customer. Then it goes into detail around those servers, non-production, storage. Another super powerful part of this tool is that it takes everything in. Azure Migrate was a great tool for going 100 virtual machines running in Azure cost X amount. What it didn't do is think about everything else. You've got to monitor those machines, back those machines up, secure those machines. This tool will take all of that into account. That's something we had to do manually previously. We had to add that ourselves into Azure Migrate. We don't have to do that anymore. This deck's huge, so I'm not going to show all of it. So there'll be a couple of pages I'll skip, but sustainability results, predictions on things like CO2 emissions by moving to Azure. And then it starts to go deeper. This slide is one of the slides that we spend the most time with when we're speaking to customers, because it highlights out of support operating systems, soon to be out of support operating systems, but most importantly, what would happen if you move them to Azure. If you move them to Azure, you can get extended security updates, often for free, depending on the date. You can have that extended support if you move it. So again, if you've got unsupported operating systems, this will understand that and suggest things to do. Gives an overview of your readiness, which ones are green and should move quite gracefully, which ones need a bit of work, and which ones at the current time are blocks. And that could be due to hardware, could do any reason. I'm going through this a little bit quick, but the last thing I'll show you is right sizing. Trust in cost is one of the blockers. Trust and predictability of cost. And as you can see here, this comes quite a long way in terms of helping that and providing that information. So if there's anyone on this call that wants to be provided an example of this deck, a cleansed version, in fact, the version I'm looking at right now, feel free, put it in the comments, I'll send it. There is 51 pages on this. And of course, that is dynamic. So depending on the size of the environment we review and the information we give it, that could be anywhere up to 200 slides. What we also have access to very quickly is, I showed you, but there's also some Excel exports as well. So the technical team might not want a PowerPoint. They might want to see how we've kind of linked applications with servers, for example. So that's one of 10 exports that you could get out of this. But jump back to my. Let's go back to the deck. If we take the objections from earlier, and this isn't a perfect science. I'm not sat here now saying if you do Dr. Migrate and some CAF work that you'll be able, that any business in the world will be, they'll know straight away they must move to the cloud and confidence will be high. But cost predictability very much can be fixed. It can be resolved by Dr. Migrate, assessments, proof of concepts. That shouldn't be a problem. Even when you're in Azure, you should have cost predictability. You can set budgets, you can set alerts. Performance is the same. Dr. Migrate goes to that extra level when it comes to performance. It truly understands an application and how it's performing at the moment. So if it's going to advise you to move to a different service in Azure, it will know whether it can handle that type of performance and whether it will actually increase it. Downtime risk, some of that can come from Dr. Migrate, but really that comes from migration planning and part of that planning phase of the framework. Similar to things like security concerns. The assessment will tell you about operating systems being out of date. It will tell you if you're not using Defender, if you haven't got antivirus. But there's far more to security boundaries than that. Technical knowledge can be resolved as part of the CAF plan stage, not CAD. I don't know why I did that. That's a spelling mistake. But again, cloud adoption framework planning stage focuses on understanding operating model now. What will operate and be modeled tomorrow? Where are the gaps? How do we plug them? Migration costs. Of course, as a partner that's done an assessment, we would be able to tell you those costs, predict those costs early doors. And then finally, change. Some people don't like change. I don't like it when shops change their aisles around, and they'll never change. But a business case, a strong business case, hopefully starts to bring more confidence in a business. And those people that are worried about change hopefully then realise that maybe it's for the best. And to make you aware, of course, we do this assessment for customers. We have an engagement that can be fully funded by Microsoft. We have to check on that, but for most customers, it is fully funded. It's a minimum of 4-day engagement on our side. It involves installing the tooling, running through the dashboards, presenting output, and having workshops with you to discuss those as well, as you can see on screen. I will bring that back up at the end, but if anyone is interested in a migration accelerator by using Dr. Migrate, then please feel free to reach out. Are there any questions at this stage? I'll just quickly check the chat. Yeah, okay. Stephen, what I'd like to do now, so you've all listened to me and shown too many decks, is don't just kind of believe me and hear it from me. We've worked with Save the Children for some time now, and we're really lucky to have Stephen on the call with us today. So welcome, Stephen. And if it's okay, buddy, you're okay to kind of introduce yourself and to start with, there's a high level of what it is you've done and how you got there, if you don't mind.
Well, thank you, Anthony. And Dr. Migrate looked really interesting, by the way. We didn't get to use it. I kind of wonder what it would have been like if we had used that. But I'm Stephen Sobman. I'm the co-director of digital data and technology at Save the Children UK. I've been here nearly 14 years now, and I think we kicked off this work with transparency 2 or 3 years ago now. Jim, want me just go over like why we? Yeah, exactly. So we had a situation where we had a data center, private cloud that was due to go to end of life, and at the same time we had our secondary site, our DR site, which is also due to go to end of life. So there's only so long you can stretch warranty. You have concerns such as when you get firmware updates, if you have cyber essential certifications and you need to make sure you're on top of those, let alone talking about how comfortable are you in the age of the infrastructure and it's staying up, or if it was to be unavailable, how confident are you bringing it back up again? So we started looking at options as to, well, what do we do with our aged infrastructure? I didn't really want to be rushed or forced into a decision where we had to buy whole new infrastructure, because that's a big upfront cost. You know, if you're mapping out, you're modeling your costs, that's then setting you on that infrastructure for the next 3 to 5 years. And the question is, will that hold us back and stop us doing what we want to do? So we went through an assessment. We looked at, do we buy new infrastructure? Do we go hybrid with ESX? We have a mixture of both, or actually do we want to move fully to cloud? And that's ultimately where we went to go, because we wanted the reliability, we wanted the scalability. We have a limited size support team, so we didn't want people split across supporting different platforms and different technologies with different ways of working. So all of this went in towards a business case as to why moving to cloud was the right case or right option for us.
This may not be the case, but the way you put it sounded like it was probably an easier business case to get across. It felt like was it so obvious that cloud was going to provide that value early on, or?
I think it's the business case was straightforward in that we had to do something, right? Because there was a set end date, and we are rapidly approaching that end date, and we need to make an informed decision. I think it was, as is the case, cloud isn't always the answer for everything. It's rarely cheaper. It's what are your outcomes? What are you trying to achieve? I think it's also important when you look in terms of costs, and it is important to right size and rationalize, which we did ahead of the migration. Is are you accounting for all the true costs of your current setup? So I don't know how many people on this call have on-premise infrastructure, but hopefully you haven't had too many occasions where you've had call outs in the early hours of the morning because I don't know you've had a power outage or a server needs to be hard booted by someone. These are the types of things you need to take into account when costing up your current setup. Even for those in private cloud, often depending on the contract you have with the provider, is very rarely are changes instantaneous. You have to go through change control. You have to wait for people resources to be available. You can't be as reactive at that point. You have to wait. So you have to build all these costs into your business case and how you want to work. But yeah, I think it helped that we did rationalize heavily and we right-sized and we looked at our licensing and we were able to predict with quite a good degree of certainty of what new costs would be. And actually, I think cloud costs have come down over the past, I don't know, 5 years or so. So the gap between buying new infrastructure where the costs have gone up or going into cloud infrastructure where the costs have, well, if not come down, but stayed fairly similar. Actually, the gap wasn't as big as we might have thought it would be.
In some areas, it's definitely come down, and I think where Microsoft have helped is it's become easier to move across services. So some move to a virtual machine example to something that is cheaper. But before, if we could present a business case where go right, it's going to be 10% cheaper a month, but it'll cost you 100 grand to do the project. You're like, but now, yeah, for sure. In terms of that business case, or it may not so, but for you, I suppose I can flip this round. But what was the most valuable to Save the Children to see in that, or let's flip that round? Is what was the biggest worry? I suppose when you were thinking about, was it cost? I assume.
Yeah, cost is always one of the biggest worries in terms of business casing, and how can you make sure you're going to get sign off and buy-in for what is necessarily optimal, but what you need to be able to meet your requirements. I think it was one important thing for us, and I'm sure a lot of people on this journey, is that we're generally on the cloud first journey. So if you map out over your next 3 to 5 years and look at your target state architecture, for most people, I would expect to see a continuation in traditional hosted applications and services. So this was another big point for us, is how much of our hosted applications do we even expect to have within 3 to 5 years? So did we want to commit to infrastructure that we wouldn't maybe need, because actually we want to reduce that over time. We're moving towards SaaS and PaaS models. So moving fully into Azure made complete sense from that perspective, as long as we could model what that reduction in cost would be over time. I think the other part of the business case wasn't just the running cost, is how do we get there and have a degree of confidence that our services will continue to run and run in the right way. So not only was it resilient and secure, but was it scalable? And this is where we made sure that we had, as part of the business case, the support of a trusted partner who could keep us true to best practice, who could help guide us through kind of Microsoft's well-architected framework for workloads or cloud adoption framework for how you set up your landing zones, for how you make sure you have the right setup in place. Because as much as we have highly capable teams and people that I fully trust, there is a question of, well, how much experience do we have in performing these migrations? How much capacity do we have? So can we truly free up all our teams from working on any other organizational outcomes, or BAU still has to happen, projects are still coming in. How are we able to free up people to work on migrating a system as they're making changes to it? And it's time framed. So we only have a small amount of time to complete the move. If we say have 12 months to complete it, we can't wait 6 months to find out that we can't do it ourselves and we need some help. So that's why we wanted a trusted partner. And I said at the start, it wasn't just migrating our primary site. We also wanted to move to Azure Site Recovery for our DR site. So I added an extra layer of complexity due to when equipment was going end of life. So we initially migrated Azure Site Recovery for our DR. Then we had to migrate into Azure for what was in our data center. We then had to re-update and apply those changes to ASR at that point as well. So, there was a lot of moving parts. So just having that, that trusted hand and assurance of someone who knows how to do these type of things was essential, and also really important in getting the business case signed off.
Of course. And I should invite you more to these, Stephen, because you touched on some buzzwords there that I always do, but landing zones, cloud adoption framework, and you touched on a really good point there. It's so common when we're speaking to businesses. There's different reasons for leaning on partners. And I was going to ask you why I lent on a partner, and you'd already kind of answered it. But there are those on one side, which is they might have a small IT infra team, 2, 3, 4 people, but they've got no Azure skills and want our help. We were working with a large insurance company last month who have an Azure team internally of 40 people, but still wanted us to do it. There's different reasons, right? There's different reasons why business, even if you've got the skills, we've done this 200, 300 times. Every business is hopefully only going to do the big bang migration once. We've probably all said that 10, 15 years ago, but hopefully we're only going to do it once. So we have seen the different ways that these can be done. And that's why we've always liked to work on. I always call it just a sliding scale. You can either give us the keys to the kingdom, we disappear, come back and go, here you go, not my preference, or let's go along this together and here you go. So it's interesting when you're describing that then, because there's at least 2 people this week, customers I've spoken to from a pre-sales point of view, still in that exact same. It's not just around the cost, it's like, how are we going to do this? How is this team going to deal with these new technologies? Operating models come into play, of course. You touched on it a little bit, which really helped me along in terms of this conversation. I was going to ask you around the value from a partner. I'll probably just kind of touch on that, but at the same time as well, were you able to use funding for any of your projects?
Yes, so there's lots of benefits to a partner, partly from what you just said, and that it gives us to a range of capabilities. So we might have thought, can we just bring in an experienced cloud migration expert to do everything, whereas actually maybe we need a bit of architecture expertise, maybe we need some project management assistance, maybe we need specific engineering expertise around, say, we have a quite complex SQL cluster that supports our key financial information. Asking one person to cover all those areas, that's quite a broad skill set, and you don't need all of the skill sets all the time. So that was really useful in having that from a partner. The other part is, yes, Microsoft do, or at least Elevate, have made funding available for nonprofits. And if there's other nonprofits, people are not nonprofit on the call, I think there's still funding available. I know less about that side. But yes, knowing how to navigate, which I think even people within Elevate and Microsoft will say is sometimes quite a complex funding process, is knowing, and it's of course based on your overall commitment, as you would expect for any kind of funding. So the larger your migration, the more your expected consumption costs are, the more you tie in other Microsoft services. Say if you're using Sentinel for your SIEM, or Defender for cloud, or any of these applications, working with a partner like yourselves helps us work out how to best apply for which grants or parts of funding, because you don't want to apply for the wrong funding, for the wrong pot, and reduce the overall amount you can get. But you also need to know what cadence those funding opportunities come up. So this also went into our business case. So as much as we could show quite a large overall number to do the migration, we could show by partnering with Transparency and through Elevate, actually, we were going to get this much extra value for this program.
And you touched on it, but I mean, we always have to check funding. But you're right. There's the not-for-profit kind of pots, but also for any other sector, there are pots there available, and it's Microsoft aren't going to come knocking on your door throwing that money at you. We've got a funding team that we can send off to go and get that. And also they change. Stephen, you'll know this. Some of these funding pots, the small print, the evidence you have to provide, that can change. That can change all the time. But the assessment that I covered today, that has its own separate funding part of Microsoft, the assessment and POE funding, which can be anywhere between 15,000 and 25,000 US dollars. So you can imagine that can fund a fairly decent assessment and start to help with business case. And then there's the funding after the fact, which, as you know, is dependent. It really depends on how much consumption cost you give Microsoft, of course. But yeah, I'm glad funding played a part. And we've found so far, being open, this can't be for every customer, but I think there's only been one assessment we've done in the last few months that isn't, especially those assessments, if you're unsure migrating and you can get it funded, why not, if it's free? And I did mention it earlier on, but it'll soon be announced that we're official partners with Ultra that make Doctor migrate. So although we have access now, in the future there'll be further access. You've touched on this a couple of times, Stephen. I want to end on one because I think it's super important. And it's got nothing to do with business cases or assessment. It's got to do with keeping going. And that is, obviously, you would have had an assessment or you had a ballpark figure around consumption costs. But once you've done those moves and you start to use Azure, I assume you've continued to look for those optimizations and kind of not just let it kind of fester. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a really important point, because I think what you'll see an initial larger spend, because as much as you might have right-sized and spec'd out your SKUs for all your services, until they're running there and those interdependencies are running there, how will they operate? You want to optimize to make sure you're not reducing capacity and cost so much that that's then a noticeable business impact, which may only be seen out of hours, or maybe since because it's non-profits. And if you're running a large campaign, you need to have certain things, or what larger workflows based on when you expect, kind of busier periods of activity. So at that, for the first 6 months or 12 months, however much assurance you need to have full sight of your kind of day-to-day operations, is you're probably not going to be committing straight away to reserving instances and storage. So when you do that, your costs come down significantly, by as much of a third. But if for the first 6 months you want to make sure you're not overspeccing or overcommitting, you will obviously, well, of course, have much higher running costs as a result. So really, you'll have to work out your own kind of risk appetite for how long you leave that, but make sure to factor that into plans, because otherwise, if your model is based on reserved pricing, you need to get there quite quickly to make sure that you're hitting your budget, but not so quickly that you're tying yourself into services that you don't need.
I couldn't put that any better. I think we it's even partners, because we want to be able to stand in front of a customer and give them a lower number per month, right? Because it's an easier win. And I think some want to run towards those reserved instances, but it's not even like reserved instances on VMs. I think some people start to work differently once they move into the cloud. So they may talk about, I don't know, RDS hosts that they only need on 9 to 5, but now all of a sudden someone can access from a personal machine. Someone in finance is logging on at 10 p.m. at night to do a bit of, like, the way people work changes. And you're right, if you start to spot them patterns and then go 6 months, even a year down the line, you can naturally start to save money this way. But those RIs look great. The discounts are amazing, but they're locked in. So it's kind of perfect.
Yeah, and as I found out recently, not all SKUs or kind of consumption-based services are forever reservable. So we went, oh, okay, those can't be reserved anymore. So you might have to actually change your SKU or change the kind of infrastructure or compute that you're using, because you can't reserve that for 3 years now. Maybe you can only reserve it for 1 year. So there's a few watch outs on there, which you'll kind of learn over time as you look to optimize and manage and review your new cloud estate.
And then there's a mass equation. We have a tool now as well, but there's another, sometimes it's actually more cost effective to switch a machine off between 9 and 5 non-working hours than it is an RI, but don't do both, because if you're paying for the RI, you might leave the thing. There's a balancing, and then there's saving plans and other layers that Microsoft like to bring out every 6 months that users, partners and customers, but it's bringing them all together to understand it.
Yeah, I think, and there's a really important way of working as well, not just from a financial point of view where you'll probably have discussions over capex versus opex, but now everything is opex, so everything has a cost. So do you still need those number of different environments or test environments? Do you need your VMs, or if you move to kind of virtual desktops, do they need to be on 24/7? And it's fine if they do, but they now have a cost. So this is when optimization is also another way of looking at rationalization and feeding back to business teams, because it might be that they absolutely have to run to that spec to that time, but now that has an ongoing cost, and is it worth that £1,000 a month, £10,000 a month to run that service, or is this an opportunity to rationalize your estate further, or look into automation to make sure that those services are only causing those costs when they need to be?
Yeah, no. I'm conscious of time, so I'll thank you, Stephen. Really, really appreciate you being able to join us today. Are there any questions from anyone? I move to the next slide. My machine's decided to lock up now. Of course, Alice. There you go, Stephen. We spoke about the demo gods. It's let me down on the last minute, but
Gareth is talking about Christmas Eve call outs. I'm going to talk about Crossrail knocking out the power several times in the Farringdon area. Infrastructure doesn't always like switching to generators or UPS, let's put it that way.
All I wanted to bring up on the screen, which my PowerPoint's blocks, was the reminder of the slide I had earlier on, really, which was around the assessment accelerator we do at Transparency. As I mentioned, it can be funded. We can use Dr. Migrate, just reach out to us, and we can see if we can get that funding and start off one of those assessments. But yeah, outside of that, just Beth, save the day, Beth. Thank you, Beth. Yeah, that slide. But really appreciate everyone joining us today. If you have any technical questions anyone thinks of after the fact, feel free to reach out to me. You can do. If you want to have a separate conversation around anything today, yeah, feel free to reach out to Transparent directly or an account manager if you've got one as well. I think there's any questions. Okay. Stephen, thank you. Really appreciate your time.